So the story from the gospel today is one of my favorites, and I really love it, because it's one of the few instances in the gospels where doctors are mentioned. So, of course, in this case, they're mentioned not in such a flattering way, but that's actually why I like it. So, this woman had gone to many doctors, and not one could heal her. And she spent all her money on them. And she was not only not better, she was worse. And I'll tell you, I feel like I can hear one of my patients telling me that. I've been to all these doctors, and no one has done anything for me. And I've got only this medical debt to show for it. It's definitely a story that keeps me humble. And it's a story that teaches me the limits of medicine. We often think of the power of medicine, but in the wake of this year with so many dead in this country and counting, 600,000 alone and counting, we also realize our limits and our weaknesses. So this woman is unnamed here, but she has a life beyond the Gospels. Her story continues. And there's a few places that you can read about her. One is in a book called The Acts of Pilate, which was written many years after the Gospels. This book is a kind of elaboration on the trial of Jesus, and I actually have quoted it when I spoke about Pilate during Lent. But there is a part in which Jesus is before Pilate, and there's this whole crowd, and people are calling out in Jesus' defense. One guy says, "He cured me and made me walk again after I was crippled for many years." And some other guy calls out from the crowd, "He cast out demons from me." You can picture this crowd. And then there's a woman who calls out, "He cured me of bleeding that had been going on for 12 years. And it's our character today. And in the Acts of Pilate, the woman is actually named. She is called Berenica, or Berenica. Berenica can also be translated as Bernice, but in Latin, the name is Veronica. And in the Acts of Pilate, she's silenced. Some of the elders in the crowd say, "A woman can't bring testimony according to our law." So Veronica is shut up and marginalized. And she would have known what that was like. Because remember, a woman who was bleeding was considered to be in an unclean state. And so she had to isolate herself. 12 years, it says, that she suffered from this. And so she was likely also suffering not just from bleeding, but from anemia. She was probably weak all the time, and she probably couldn't think straight. She was likely childless, or definitely didn't have any children after the bleeding. She couldn't really have a husband, or at least she had to be isolated from him if she did have one. She was probably friendless, and there was no one who could help her. And it's this suffering that I want to hold on to just for a moment, because it's easy for us to move on quickly during these type of stories. They seem just like simple miracle stories, like wonder-working stories. And for us moderns, that we have a hard time with this kind of thing, these deeds of power. But I think there's something meaningful here for us. Through the years, I have had to be with a lot of people who suffer. They suffer from things as simple as broken bones, or the flu, or pneumonia. They suffer from heart failure and diabetes and cancer. They suffer from loneliness and depression and anxiety. They suffer from dementia, Parkinson's disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, strokes. But it's not only doctors who are with those who suffer. Many people must be caregivers for others. We hold others in their suffering. And sometimes, many times, we can't fix it. We can't save the sufferer. We can't make them whole. Many times there are limits to what we can do. And the temptation in those moments is to flee, to ignore. The disciples want Jesus to do just that. They say, "What do you mean, who touched you? Can't you see we're in the midst of this crowd pressing upon us? Let's move on, they seem to say. And sometimes I want to move on when someone pours out to me their sadness or their pain. And I'm sure if you have ever had to be a caregiver, or even if your friend just unloads something on you that's kind of heavy, you have a temptation to flee. It's like we've already got enough on our plates, it can feel like. But there's also a temptation during those times to beat ourselves up for those feelings. To be like, I shouldn't feel that way. I should really want to be here. And we think that it must mean that we don't really care. But in fact, it is because that we do care. Because we can hear what is being said and we realize, wow, this person is suffering and I can't do a lot to help them. And so it can be tempting to flee or to distract ourselves and fail to listen. Now, in our story, this woman, Veronica, we'll call her now, persists. She says, if only I could touch the hem of his garment, I will be saved or made whole. That's what the Greek word says. And Jesus turns to look for her among the crowd. He had felt a power go out of him, and Veronica turns back and says, it was I who touched you. And he says, your faith has saved you. Your faith has made you whole. So again, that phrase, your faith has saved you, we can gloss over that. It seems like something that we have heard before, like it was telling us if we could just have faith, all manner of problem would be solved. And I do think Mark's gospel is talking about the power of faith. I do believe in the power of faith, but I also think that there's something important to hear, something else important as well. Jesus is saying to this woman, a woman who was unclean, remember, who was shunned, marginalized, sick, lonely. He's saying to her, you do matter. You are human. You are a child of God. You are worthy of love. You are no longer on the margins. And you have a name. Jesus became suddenly and wholly present to her in that moment. And I think it was really then, at least that's what I want to believe, that she truly felt whole. Now there's a couple other ancient stories of Veronica. There's one in which, from the church historian Eusebius, where he says that she lived in Caesarea Philippi, and that she had erected a statue of Jesus, actually, at the gates of her house. And the statue shows a woman kneeling, and before her is a figure dressed in robes, and there's a vine, a healing vine actually, carved coming up the cloak, the robe. And it was said that this statue would provide cures for many illnesses. And there's another story that you might remember if you have ever done the Stations of the Cross. Veronica is the one who wipes Jesus' sweat, his sweat-covered face, with her cloth. And the legend says that Jesus' face becomes printed on it. Some people say it's the first icon of Jesus. And it's at that moment that she becomes Saint Veronica. So Veronica, whose faith made her whole, becomes present to Jesus during his own suffering as he was to her. And we can often forget that what makes for healing is not always the pharmaceuticals or the ventilators that we can wield. It's our own compassionate presence. And the world today needs this presence. There's a lot of suffering right now, a lot of anger and violence, a lot of confusion and division. Remember, Veronica waded into the crowd even though she was thought to be unclean, to seek out her salvation. She then waded into the procession to Calvary, to Golgotha, to wipe the sweat from Jesus' brow under the brutal eyes of the Roman escort. Traditionally, in her icon, Veronica is shown holding the face of Jesus printed on the cloth she used that day. She forever bears the icon of Christ. So today, let us remember Veronica. Let us remember her courage and her persistence. Let us remember, above all, her own compassion. Out of her own healing, she becomes whole again. But she turns not inward, she turns outward toward the world with compassion. Like Veronica, let us persist in seeking our own wholeness and healing, but not for our own sakes alone, but for those we care about. Let us persist on the journey, again, not for ourselves alone, but out of compassion. Let us also become bearers of Veronica's cloth, the icon of Jesus, the icon of compassion. Amen.